Every damn morning, for longer than he cared to count, Silas had left a cup of cold coffee on that lonely gravestone by Widow's Creek. It was his ritual, his silent confession to a past that wouldn't die. But today, something was different. A single, fresh rose, crimson against the weathered stone, sat there, already claiming the spot he thought was only his. A jolt went through him, cold as the creek water, stirring a forgotten ache deep in his chest. Who else knew about this place? And why now? The old fear, a whisper he'd silenced for years, began to hum. The sun was just clawing its way over the eastern ridges, painting the sky in a bruised purple, when Silas Thatch rode out. His ranch, more of a collection of sun-baked shacks and a few stubborn cattle than anything grand, lay nestled in a forgotten valley, miles from any decent town. Every morning, before the world truly woke, he'd saddle Old Blue, a horse as old and weary as himself, and ride the 2 miles down to Widow's Creek. His foreman, a wiry, taciturn man named Jeb Stone, was already mending a fence near the corral, his face obscured by the brim of his dusty hat. Jeb was a man of few words, but sharp eyes, and he'd been with Silas longer than anyone. Silas asked, his voice low, almost conversational, but with an edge. His eyes, the color of faded denim, scanned Silas's face. "Nope. Found a rose fresh on that grave by the creek. Just the usual dust and flies. Why? Something troubling you?" It wasn't for water or pasture. It was for the gravestone. And it was a direct challenge to his carefully constructed solitude. His gravestone, in a way. And today, the sight of that rose, a splash of vibrant red on the gray stone, hit him harder than a kick from a wild mustang. He dismounted slowly, his boots crunching on the dry earth, the familiar weight of his colt on his hip a comfort, though he didn't know against what. He looked out across the valley, towards the winding path of Widow's Creek. The sun was higher now, its heat beginning to bake the land. The rose was a signal, a message. He just didn't know what it meant or who it was from. But he knew one thing. He couldn't ignore it. He had to find out. The quiet life he'd carved out for himself, built on the shifting sand of old pain, was suddenly, irrevocably shattered. A rose on that grave? His voice was a strained whisper. "Silas, that ain't right. Ain't no one been near there in a lifetime." The air was still, save for the buzz of a few early flies and the distant caw of a crow. To the air, to the quiet, to himself, he stood, his gaze sweeping the sparse landscape. To his left, the creek snaked through the valley, thin and shallow. To his right, the dusty trail led back to his ranch, and beyond that, to the ghost of a town called Redemption, a place he hadn't set foot in for 20 years. A hawk circled high above, a patient predator. He felt a similar patience settle over him now, a hunter's calm, but mixed with a tremor of something else, a deep, unsettling curiosity. He knelt, his leathery fingers brushing the soft petals of the rose. It was fresh, dewy, placed with care. Not some random wildflower. Someone had been here, recently, intentionally. His jaw tightened. This creek, this grave, it was his solitary burden. He hadn't seen another soul near here in decades, not since the grave was dug. "Morning, old friend," he muttered, though not to the grave. He walked Old Blue back to the ranch, his mind turning over the rose like a smooth river stone. He needed answers. "Morning, Silas," Jeb grunted, not looking up from his work. "Morning, Jeb. You see anyone pass by early this morning? Anyone at all?" Jeb paused, hammer in hand, and finally looked up. Silas hesitated. To tell Jeb about the rose would be to open a door he'd kept locked for too long. But the rose was there. It was real. No, just felt like eyes on me this morning. Silas lied, then reconsidered. He rarely lied to Jeb. Jeb's hammer dropped with a thud. His eyes widened, and for the first time in years, A flicker of genuine surprise, even shock, crossed his face. Silas nodded, a grim confirmation. Exactly. And now someone has. The next morning, the rose was still there, vibrant as ever, defiant. Silas brought another cup of coffee, cold, as always, and placed it beside the crimson bloom. A prank? Unlikely, given the isolation. A drifter? But a drifter with a rose and a knowledge of that specific, unmarked grave? No, this was personal. Most folks had moved on when the silver dried up. He was a younger man, perhaps in his late 20s, with a lean build and eyes that seemed to have seen too much. His clothes were warm but clean, and a well-maintained rifle rested against his chair. This was Marshall Clay Dixon, Redemption's reluctant lawman. He'd only been in town a few months, and Silas rarely spoke to him. The air hung heavy with dust and the smell of stale beer. Just a feeling. Something feels out of place. A rose. His eyes, however, betray a flicker of something. Recognition? Surprise? Silas couldn't tell. Not many folks know about that spot. A fresh one. Found it on a grave out by Widow's Creek. He hitched Old Blue outside the saloon, the Lucky Star, its swing doors creaking a mournful welcome. And you think it's connected to a stranger? But if you're talking about a specific out of place, you'd best be specific yourself, Silas. Inside, the usual collection of weathered faces hunched over their drinks. It gnawed at him, a splinter of suspicion buried deep. He waited, hidden in the sparse brush nearby, for an hour. Then two. Nothing. Just the wind whispering secrets through the dry grass. I know a lot of things, Silas, but not everything. This town's got its share of ghosts, and some of them ain't staying buried. The silence, once a comfort, now felt like a taunt. Silas challenged. Unless you know something about it, Marshall? Silas felt a cold dread creep up his spine. Dixon's reaction wasn't just surprise. It was a warning. And his mention of ghosts hinted at something deeper, something far more personal than a simple drifter. Silas realized, with a jolt, that this wasn't just about a rose on a grave anymore. This was about something coming back from the past. And he had a sinking feeling he knew whose past it was. He'd come looking for answers, and instead, he'd found a new layer to the mystery, a sense of a quiet threat growing louder. He had lost the comfort of his solitude, and with it, a piece of his hard-won peace. Seen any strangers pass through lately? Anyone new sticking around? He spent the day checking fences, pushing cattle, his mind a whirlwind of possibilities. Silas, ain't seen you in town much. Everything all right out at the ranch? Strangers? Depends on what you mean. We get a few drifters, sure, but no one causing trouble. No one of note. He paused, his gaze sharp. Why do you ask? Late in the afternoon, Silas rode into Redemption. The town was little more than a main street with a saloon, a general store, and a blacksmith. A lone figure sat at a table in the corner, hunched over a mug of something dark. Silas walked to the bar, ordered a whiskey, and nursed it slowly. He felt Dixon's gaze on him, a quiet assessment. Finally, Dixon spoke, his voice surprisingly soft. Silas took a long swallow of whiskey. As good as it gets, Marshall. Just had a question for you. Dixon stirred his drink with a calloused finger. Silas considered his words carefully. Dixon nodded slowly. Out of place is about right for this town. Silas met his gaze. Dixon's expression didn't change, but his grip on his mug tightened, his knuckles turning white. Widow's Creek, huh? Dixon said, his voice flat. That's a ways out. Exactly, Silas replied, pushing his glass forward. And it wasn't there yesterday. Someone put it there. Dixon slowly set his mug down. What else would it be? Dixon leaned back in his chair, a shadow crossing his face. His words hung in the air, heavy and cryptic. The sun beat down on Redemption's dusty main street, relentless and unforgiving. Silas walked out of the saloon, the marshal's words echoing in his mind. Some of them I on staying buried. She was slender, with a weather beauty that spoke of hardship and resilience. Her hair, the color of twilight, was pulled back in a severe bun, and her eyes, though shadowed, held a fierce, unsettling intensity. She paused, her gaze locking onto Silas's. A jolt, sharp and sudden, went through him. The phrase had struck a chord, a discordant note in the carefully orchestrated symphony of his solitary life. He mounted Old Blue, his gaze drifting east, towards the jagged peaks of the Diablo Mountains, where the memories truly lay buried. The Rose, her face was unreadable, a mask of weary resolve. Silas felt a wave of conflicting emotions wash over him. Guilt, regret, a lingering affection for the girl he'd known, and a fresh surge of fear. "Alara, I didn't know you were here." Fear of what she knew, of what she would say, of the truth she might force him to confront. The grave. The marshal's cryptic words. It all clicked into place with a horrifying certainty. Some of us find our way back to the dust we came from. Others try to bury it. Her eyes, once full of youthful fire, now held the cold glint of accusation. He had a choice: turn away and let the past consume him, or face it, head on, no matter how painful. The rational part of him screamed to retreat, to maintain the solitude that had been his refuge. But his heart, raw and exposed, yearned for something else. Absolution, perhaps, or simply the truth. He chose the latter. He had to. The past wasn't just returning. It was demanding its due. "Did you forget about Thomas, Silas? About your promise?" Alara. He wanted to run, to ride away and disappear into the vast, unforgiving landscape. But he couldn't. Not now. Not with Alara standing before him, a living, breathing testament to his greatest failure. She was connected to the grave, to Thomas, to his past, and the promise. Suddenly, a woman stepped out of the general store, a burlap sack clutched in her arms. Alara. He gripped the reins of Old Blue, his knuckles white. Alara was still there, her eyes still fixed on his, not with recognition, but with a strange, searching quality. She was older, lines of sorrow etched around her eyes, but it was undoubtedly her. He hadn't seen her since before the war, since he'd ridden off with Thomas, full of naive patriotism. He hadn't known she was even alive, let alone in redemption. The name, a whisper from a forgotten time, formed on his lips but remained unspoken. For a moment, the world around them seemed to fade, replaced by a vivid, agonizing flashback. The year was 1864. The air tasted of smoke and fear. Silas, younger, leaner, stood beside Alara by a flickering campfire, the distant boom of cannons a grim lullaby. Her face, tear-streaked and defiant, was etched into his memory. "Promise me, Silas," she pleaded, her voice raw. "You'll look after him. No matter what. Promise me." He'd squeezed her hand, a silent vow made in the chaos of war. A promise to her brother, a young idealistic soldier named Thomas. A promise he'd failed to keep. The memory shattered, leaving Silas gasping, as if he'd been punched in the gut. He swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. Alara, as if sensing his internal turmoil, began to walk towards him, her steps slow and deliberate. "Silas Thatch," she said, her voice raspy, a ghost of the melodic sound he remembered. "I never thought I'd see you again." He dismounted, his movements stiff. She gave a humorless laugh, a sound like dry leaves skittering across rock. The directness of her question was a blow. His carefully constructed wall of indifference crumbled. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw the depth of her grief, a mirror of his own, long suppressed.
The air in redemption crackled with an unspoken tension as Silas stood face to face with Alara. The easy rhythm of his lonely life was gone, replaced by a relentless drumbeat of an impending storm. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone. that the confrontation he'd avoided for 2 decades was finally here. "Elara," he began, his voice hoarse, "I never forgot about Thomas, not for a day. I buried him myself, Elara. By Widow's Creek, I heard nothing, not a word from you, not a word about my brother. You rode off and he died. He stood his ground when others ran. He bought us time, and you let him fade away, just like you faded away." The weight of that promise, broken in the chaos of battle, pressed down on him. "You didn't try hard enough. You abandoned him, just like you abandoned me." "I tried, Elara. God help me. I tried." He moved slowly, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. Dixon asked, his voice calm, but with an underlying steel. His presence, though silent, was a powerful deterrent. Sometimes it's best left buried. "You know what Silas did? Under the biggest oak I could find?" His voice was a low growl, laced with a pain that was still raw. "I wrote to you, tried to find you, but the war scattered everyone." She clutched it to her chest, her eyes blazing. This is Thomas's journal. I found it amongst his belongings years after the war. Wrote it all down, Silas. Everything. And I've read every single word." Silas felt a desperate need to defend himself, to explain the impossible choices made in the hell of war. But the words caught in his throat. How could he explain the unexplainable? The chaos, the fear, the split-second decisions that meant life or death. Not just for himself, but for those he was sworn to protect. She scoffed, a bitter sound. "Funny, because your absence spoke louder than any words, Silas. For 20 years, I waited, I hoped. And then I came here, to this God-forsaken place, to find the truth myself." Her eyes narrowed. "Did you even know where he was buried? Or did you just leave him for the buzzards?" This wasn't just about Thomas. It was about betrayal, about a life shattered by the echoes of a war that refused to die. The accusation stung, sharp and immediate. All the years of self-deception, of trying to rewrite the past, crumbled in that instant. This was it, the moment of reckoning. Everything seemed lost. Its fragile peace, its carefully constructed anonymity. All of it was about to be laid bare. "Lies," she spat, her voice rising, drawing the attention of a few curious onlookers. "To run back to your quiet ranch and forget all about the boy who believed in you?" Her voice trembled, on the verge of breaking. "He trusted you. You swore you'd protect him." "He died a hero, Elara," Silas countered, his own anger simmering. "Time for what, Silas? Time for you to save your own skin." Silas flinched, the memory of Thomas's bright, eager face flashing before his eyes. "No," she cried, a tear finally escaping and cutting a path through the dust on her cheek. The words hit him like a physical blow. He saw the pain in her eyes, but also a deep-seated rage nurtured for years. Suddenly, Marshal Dixon stepped out of the saloon, drawn by the rising voices. "Everything all right here?" Elara turned on him, her anger momentarily diverted. "Know about Thomas, Marshal? You know about the soldiers buried out there?" Dixon's face was unreadable. "I know enough, ma'am. I know the past is a tricky thing, not when promises are broken," Elara retorted, her gaze fixed back on Silas. "He left Thomas to die." The accusation hung in the air, a poisonous cloud. Then, in a shocking twist, Elara pulled something from her sack. It was a faded, leather-bound journal. Silas felt a cold wave wash over him. Thomas's journal. The final, irrefutable witness to his broken promise.
The journal, a small, unassuming book, felt like a thunderbolt in Elara's hand. Silas stood frozen, his mind reeling. Thomas's journal. It was a phantom from his past, now horrifyingly real, ready to expose his deepest shame. Marshal Dixon, sensing the shift in the air, took a step closer, his gaze moving between Silas and Elara, a silent referee in a battle of old wounds. The crowd that had gathered slowly dispersed, sensing the deeply personal nature of the conflict. Silas and Elara were left standing in the dusty street, two figures alone in a world that suddenly felt too big, too unforgiving. A profound weariness settled over Silas, a fatigue that went bone deep. War takes good men and makes them do things they never imagined. It makes promises crumble to dust. "I want the truth, Silas. The whole truth. Not the stories you tell yourself to sleep at night." He was bruised, emotionally, and perhaps spiritually, by the raw honesty of Alara's pain and the shattering reveal of the journal. Or he could face it all, tell her the unvarnished, brutal truth, and finally put the ghost of Thomas to rest, even if it meant tearing himself apart in the process. "All right, Alara," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Come with me to Widow's Creek, and I'll tell you everything. Every last damn thing that happened. It was a huge risk." He was giving her everything, his vulnerability, his secret, his soul. But it was the only way. His heart hammered in his chest, a mixture of fear and a strange, liberating sense of purpose. He would walk towards the inevitable, towards the reckoning, with courage and a crippling doubt about what awaited him at the end of the long road. He had lived with the lie for so long, had built his life around it, but the weight of it was suffocating him. He saw the cold coffee and the rose, not as symbols of his private grief, but as a challenge, an invitation to finally confront the past. Even with people around him, a profound loneliness settled over him, the familiar companion of his cowboy existence. The marshal represented law, order, and perhaps a path to some kind of official record, some official closure. But this wasn't a matter for the law. This was personal. This was a wartime promise, made between a boy and a girl and broken by a man. He had lived with this secret, this failure, for so long that it had become a part of him, a scar on his soul. Now it was being ripped open. He looked at Alara, truly saw her, not as the ghost of a past love, but as a grieving sister, clinging to the last tangible link to her lost brother, the journal. It was her only connection. "Alara," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "what do you want?" She clutched the journal tighter, her eyes still blazing with a mixture of grief and anger. "I don't believe you, not anymore. Not until I hear it from your own lips, what truly happened to my brother. Why you left him." He looked away, across the empty street, towards the distant hills. "The truth is never as simple as we want it to be," Silas finally said, his voice flat. Alara shook her head, a tear tracking down her cheek. A strong gust of wind swept through the street, kicking up dust devils, a fitting reflection of the turmoil within him. He had a choice, a final, gut-wrenching decision. He could deny, deflect, try to salvage what little dignity he had left. His gaze drifted to Marshal Dixon, who stood quietly by the saloon doors, his expression unreadable. He took a deep breath, the dust filling his lungs. The walk to Widow's Creek was a silent, agonizing journey. The afternoon sun cast long, distorted shadows as Silas and Alara, followed by a watchful Marshal Dixon, made their way across the parched land. The air was thick with unspoken words, with years of pain and unspoken grief. When they reached the small, unmarked grave, the rose was still there, a vibrant beacon in the desolate landscape. Silas placed his cold coffee beside it, a final, symbolic offering. He knelt by the stone, his fingers tracing the rough surface. Alara stood beside him, clutching Thomas's journal, her face pale but resolute. Alara stood motionless, her eyes fixed on the gravestone. A single tear escaped, then another, flowing freely now, not just from anger, but from understanding. "Protecting us all. I came back for him, Alara. After the fighting, I found him here, and I buried him, with my own hands. I left the coffee for him every day, because it was the last thing we shared." She knelt beside Silas, her hand reaching out, not to touch the stone, but to touch his weathered hand. It was a silent gesture, a profound forgiveness. And I never told anyone, because it felt too sacred, too painful. We were scouting ahead, Thomas and I young, full of fire, thinking we were invincible. Not to you, not in the way you wanted. The cowboy, once a solitary figure haunted by a past he couldn't share, was transformed. He was still a man of the land, still quiet, but no longer alone. The cold coffee remained, but now, perhaps, A fresh rose would always be there beside it, a shared memory, a promise finally kept, not just to the dead, but to the living, but to him. I honored his sacrifice, and I lived with his death, every single day, right here. He tapped his chest. He paused, a vivid flashback forcing its way into his mind. The sudden roar of musket fire, the terrified whinny of horses, the screams. They came out of nowhere, Confederates, a whole company. He wrote about you in here, about your bravery, about how you were like a brother to him. He looked at the grave, then at Alara, and finally at Marshal Dixon, who gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The truth, painful as it was, had brought not just understanding, but a strange, fragile peace. She looked at him, her eyes finally clear. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know." Marshal Dixon remained a respectful distance, a quiet sentinel. "It was a trap," Silas began, his voice low, a raw whisper carried on the wind. He yelled, a warning. He knew his journey wasn't over, but the heaviest part of it was finally behind him. The last rays of sun painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, a melancholic beauty. He thought of Thomas, of Alara, of the sacrifices made, and the long, winding road to absolution. He could have run, Alara. He could have, but he didn't. He grabbed his rifle, stood his ground. "Go, Silas," he shouted. "Warn the others." "I'll hold him off," Silas's voice cracked. He was just a boy, but he had the heart of a lion. Alara's breath hitched. She tightened her grip on the journal, said, "You promised me, Silas. You promised you'd make it back." And then he turned, a living target, firing into the thick of them. "He bought us time, Alara. Precious minutes. Enough for me to get away, to warn the company. Enough for the rest of us to live." Thomas. He saw them first. He looked at Alara, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. I hesitated. God forgive me, I hesitated. But he shoved me. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk. "He died protecting me," Silas continued, his voice heavy with the weight of years. He looked at her, his soul laid bare. "I kept my promise, Alara." Alara slowly lowered the journal. Her gaze softened, the anger fading, replaced by a profound sorrow. "He loved you, Silas," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. The weight lifted from Silas's shoulders was immense, a burden he'd carried for decades. The setting sun cast long golden shadows across Widow's Creek. Nothing would ever be exactly as it was. Silas stood, looking out over the creek, the wind rustling the dry grass. He looked at the gravestone, then back at Alara, a faint smile touching his lips. "He never liked hot coffee much anyway,"